Moving along here, Wei Lee asked us, how were the Israelites supposed to understand from the scripture that there are two comings of Christ? Because on the mountain peaks of prophecy in the Old Testament, often the first and second coming of Jesus were mixed up. As far as I know, some Jewish rabbis came as far as proclaiming there are two different messiahs, a humble suffering one and a conquering reigning one. But based on scripture alone, how could the Israelites have figured out the same Messiah was coming twice?
Actually, you answered the question in your question. One of the things that you recognize, and you're absolutely right. Some of the Jewish rabbis believed that there were two messiahs that were coming, and the way that they chose to reconcile that wasn't by a first and a second coming; it was by coming up with two different messiahs. Basically, when you go through Isaiah chapter 53, let me just go through it real quick.
Do you know, was that a popular view at the time of Christ, the two messiahs?
Yeah, Messiah ben David and Messiah ben Joseph is what they thought. So in Isaiah 53, it's talking about a suffering Messiah, and you probably know the passage. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Chastisement for our peace was upon him. It goes on in verse 7, he's oppressed and afflicted, opened not his mouth. In verse 8, taken from prison, he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. In verse 9, they made his grave, and so he dies, right? With the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he'd done no violence. In verse 10, it says, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, he has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, so that makes it clear that this is an atoning sacrifice. Then at the second part of verse 10, it says, he shall see his seed. And so that is talking about the fact that there are going to be people that there's fruit that comes from this whole act. He shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days and cause his days to be long. And it's the idea of he shall live long, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. And so there's prosperity that's coming for the same Messiah who's already dead. And you could talk about that being heaven, but it's like it puts him in the act of seeing his seed and being involved in that. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Well, how do you do that after you're dead? Because he poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors and bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So even in the passage itself, it gives an indication that there's a resurrection that's taken place, and not only a resurrection, but a prosperity that's taken place because of what Jesus did on the cross. And so even in the connection of the suffering Messiah, you see this prosperous conquering Messiah, which is Messiah ben David, that the Jews would be talking about. And so it was just a theological situation where they chose to come up with two messiahs instead of thinking, well, maybe one Messiah coming two times. And it was just their choice, and it got cemented in their thinking. In the same way, when you look at the second coming of Christ, there's two second comings of Christ. And so one is absolutely unexpected, and the other one comes after a series of events. And so the unexpected one is the one that we're supposed to be watching for. Jesus said I could come at any moment. And so you need to constantly be ready. In fact, I'm coming in at a time that you do not expect, an hour that you're not going to be ready for unless you're ready all the time, is the point that he made. And that's in Matthew 25 or Matthew 24, among other passages. And so there's an unexpected coming of Jesus that we all need to be ready for. And yet Jesus said that at his second coming, there was going to be a series of events that were going to take place. And so the rise of the Antichrist and the rise of apostasy and destruction of major portions of the world, so bad that if he didn't come back, no flesh would be saved, that kind of thing. And so I'm either supposed to be sitting here waiting for a Jesus coming and it's unexpected, or I need to look for the Antichrist first? So which one is it? And the answer is that it's both. And we know this basically because we know how he came the first time. First time he came as a suffering servant, and then he said, I'm coming back as the conquering Messiah. And so the second coming of Christ actually comes in two phases. Phase one, coming unexpectedly for the church and taking his people out. Phase two, coming with the church and basically coming to conquer the earth and set up his kingdom. And people get confused with that. And they try to allegorize the first coming, usually the coming for the church. They try to allegorize that and say, well, we're not really waiting for Jesus to come at any moment because, and blah, 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 blah. And they don't take it seriously because they can't figure out how to deal with those two. And, it's somewhat the same thing that you had in the Old Testament. And so, what they did was they tried to, in Old Testament times, they did as you spoke about. They tried to come up with two different messiahs. In New Testament times, we have church people just ignoring Scripture.
Or they try and make us Israel and put us through tribulation, explain all that stuff away, which doesn't answer a lot of those verses anyway, but goes back to bad interpretation methods. So in that time of the Lord, then they must have not, that must have not been the popular interpretation, because they completely missed the Messiah because they were looking for the ruling and reigning version of it.
Exactly. And obviously, if you're going through the Old Testament passages, who wants a guy who's just going to die?
Yeah. And also, being under the Romans, I want you to have victory over this.
Right.
I'm tired of being under their thumb.
And even after Jesus had died and risen from the dead, you have the apostles in Acts chapter 1 saying, so now are we going to do it?
Yeah.
Now is this going to happen?
Yeah. Even John the Baptist is kind of looking at that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the things I like to tell people is after 3.5 years of ministry with Jesus, these guys are still expecting a literal kingdom of Christ on the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Jesus doesn't say that's not happening. Yeah. So, yeah.
Good stuff.